Chapter 497. Delusion 5. The smile silently disappeared from Gavid's face. He did feel a burst of anger, but to be honest he couldn't muster up any offended pride in the face of Eugene's remark. After all, it was true that he had launched a surprise attack on Eugene, attempting to kill the hero, when he knew that Eugene wasn't capable of putting up any resistance. He knew that he was just making excuses for himself, but in the end Gavid still said, "I do feel some shame for my actions, but I don't think I did anything wrong." That was what Gavid truly believed. He hadn't wanted to swing his blade at that moment. Yet even so he had still swung his sword at Eugene. Then in the end, at the very last moment, Gavid had held back his sword. All of these conflicting behaviors were because of two things: Gavid's lust for battle as a demon folk and his honor as the blade of incarceration. His decision to launch a surprise attack was just his attempt to fulfill his duty as the Duke of Helmuth. "Oh, how fine, I get it," Eugene responded with a skeptical snort. He wasn't bringing this up because he wanted to hear something like an excuse from Gavid. Although it might be quite fun to keep poking at Gavid's innermost feelings in front of everyone. Let's hold back from that urge for now, Eugene decided. If his body had been in healthy condition, that was definitely something he would have done. Eugene clicked his tongue in disappointment. It was obvious that if he kept provoking Gavid in this current situation where he wasn't even able to protect himself, it would clearly only bring harm to the people around him. "By the way, we aren't anywhere close enough for you to welcome me back, are we?" Eugene pointed out. "Your words are so harsh," Gavid complained. "Ha, but since there is such a difference in our stations, I suppose it can't be helped. After all, you are the one who's been deceiving me from the very beginning by hiding your true identity. So what, does that piss you off?" Eugene scoffed. Gavid shook his head. "No, I'm not angry. However, I do feel a slight sense of astonishment. I would never have thought that you would actually know how to use such a tactic." Now that he knew Eugene was the reincarnation of Hamel, Gavid had smoothly organized everything else that had been puzzling him. Their first meeting in this life had been at the night march. After receiving the invitation from the Demon King of Incarceration, Eugene had immediately drawn the holy sword and attacked Gavid. At that time, Gavid was too distracted by the words that the Demon King of Incarceration had left with to retaliate against Eugene's attack, and afterward, Eugene had distracted everyone from his attempt to kill Gavid by claiming to have received a revelation from the light. Now that Gavid thought about it, the whole thing had just been a blatant assassination attempt on Eugene's part. Eugene shook his head. "Really now, all I did was refrain from saying anything I shouldn't while I left an idiot like you to come to your own conclusions. Is something like that really impressive enough to be called a tactic?" As soon as he had finished speaking, Eugene felt the urge to cringe. He was trying hard not to provoke Gavid, but his mouth had just started moving on its own and ended up provoking Gavid anyway. On top of that, this provocation seemed to have been quite effective, as Gavid's expression was rapidly chilling. If they kept conversing on this topic, Eugene felt like he would just continue provoking Gavid without even realizing he was doing so. So Eugene immediately changed the subject. "Did the Demon King of Incarceration order you to do this?" In fact, this new topic was exactly what Eugene had been hoping to ask Gavid about. "What are you speaking of exactly?" Gavid asked with a frown. "I'm talking about you trying to kill me," Eugene reminded him. "Ha!" Gavid shook his head, seeming genuinely displeased by Eugene's insinuation. "There is no way that my lord, the Demon King of Incarceration, would give such a cowardly order." Eugene snickered. So you do know that what you did was cowardly." "Not again." This time as well, in contrast to Eugene's best intentions, yet another provocation had leaped out from his lips. Eugene wanted to take his words back as soon as he said them, but he also inwardly felt aggrieved. No matter how he thought about it, he couldn't help but think it was Gavid's fault for being such an idiot who kept showing him such good openings for a verbal jab. "I do acknowledge that," Gavid replied with a calm expression, showing no sign of having been shaken by the accusation. "I don't need you to accept my reasons for committing such an act. From the beginning to the end, I just chose to do what I thought was right." "Heh," Eugene just chuckled in response. "Are you dissatisfied with my explanation?" Gavid asked pointedly. Eugene rolled his eyes. Why ask something so obvious? "Hamel." The corners of Gavid's lips twitched upwards in a smile. "No, Eugene Lionheart. The only reason you are alive right now is that I showed you mercy. It's because I held my sword back at the very last moment. The only reason you swung your sword at me without any warning was that you were scared of me, Eugene replied with the same sort of smile. So now what? What are you going to do? Are you going to swing your sword once more and try to kill me again? You should already know the answer to that, Gavid stated drily. If he killed Eugene now, Gavid felt like he would end up regretting it for the rest of his life. I won't kill you today, Gavid promised. After all, that is what my lord, the Demon King of Incarceration, wills. However, as it turns out, I myself have also decided on my own initiative not to cut you down just yet. Although he had admitted this, Gavid himself felt a little puzzled about his current choice of behavior. For Gavid, the will of the Demon King of Incarceration was absolute. Gavid would never willingly go against that. However, when he drew his sword earlier and launched his surprise attack, that hadn't been a part of the Demon King of Incarceration's will at all. Gavid was the Archduke of Helmuth. This title had been granted to him by the Demon King of Incarceration. For the past 300 years he had overseen the Devildom's, the entire empire's development. Helmuth was an empire in the truest sense of the word, one that was unrivaled by any other country on the continent. Gavid had swung his sword at Eugene because he thought that it was just the right thing for him to do as the Archduke of the Empire. Next time, Gavid began to speak slowly. In the end, at the very final moment, Gavid had held back his sword. It was for the sake of his battle lust as a demon folk. To live up to his honor as the Blade of Incarceration. Because he didn't want to someday regret his actions. In order to cleanly move past the lingering feelings he had because of Hamel that had been deeply imprinted into his memories. 300 years ago, Gavid wouldn't have had to deal with such complex considerations. As a blade, Gavid had told himself that he should just do what a blade does and follow his master's orders. As such, Gavid had now been left with no choice but to admit it. Without any cowardice, I will face you head-on and take your neck, Gavid solemnly vowed. Even Gavid himself had changed over these past 300 years. Could this change be something he should be happy to accept? Or perhaps should he mock himself for going through such unwanted changes? Hiding the wry feeling within him, Gavid took a step backward. Pass on a message for me, Eugene said to the retreating Gavid. If you have something you have to say, don't be so coy and just say it to me directly. His words were meant for the Demon King of Incarceration. Gavid paused in his tracks to glare at Eugene. Eugene's tone was extremely disrespectful. Gavid felt the urge to draw his sword right then and there, but he couldn't just appear to change his mind less than 1 minute after making such a vow. In the end, Gavid just turned around without responding. In terms of suspicions, Gavid also had his fair share. This war over Nahama had felt extremely strange. The Demon King of Incarceration hadn't just condoned the actions of the Spectre. He had fully supported them. Thanks to that, Helmuth had lost all of the supergiant demonic beasts that had been sealed away and revested to be used in case of emergencies. That wasn't the only loss. Amelia Merwin, the staff of incarceration, had also been subdued and taken prisoner. Quite a few high-ranking demon folk and all of the black wizards whom they had embedded in Nahama had died as well. On top of that, most of the demon folk who had lived in the fief of the Demon King of Destruction, Ravesta, had also perished. Although Gavid didn't think that the Demon King of Destruction would actually get angry over the loss of so many vassals, what if the Demon King of Destruction were to go on a rampage? Gavid could already feel his head pounding in stress as he swallowed back a sigh. It would be nice if he could at least give me a hint, Gavid thought to himself. He just couldn't tell what the Demon King of Incarceration was thinking. As this thought went through his mind, Gavid opened a spatial door and walked through it. Bastard, I was worried that he might suddenly pull his sword on me again, Eugene grumbled with a sigh of relief once he was sure Gavid had fully disappeared. Sienna, who had landed next to him, rolled her eyes in exasperation at Eugene's rude tongue. If you were worried that that bastard might attack you, couldn't you have just avoided provoking him in the first place? Sienna complained. Bam. Sienna delivered a stinging smack on Eugene's shoulder. Normally, the sting of the slap wouldn't have felt anywhere near as bad as it sounded, but right now Eugene's state was far from normal. His body was about as weak as it could get. Eugene gritted his teeth to suppress the scream that he had been about to unconsciously let loose, but he couldn't do anything about the fact that his body had started shaking involuntarily as if he was having convulsions. Had Sienna really hit him without knowing what kind of state he was in? Of course not. As someone who had been Hamel's comrade before he even became Eugene, there was no way that Sienna couldn't know about the backlash that he would need to deal with once ignition had ended. It was an extremely intentional and emotion-driven act on Sienna's part when she had smacked Eugene just now. This son of a bitch, Sienna silently cursed. What could he have been talking about with that damned queen of the sluts, when it was just the two of them? What on earth had the pair gotten up to on their own? What could have been so important that they even went so far as to block all sounds and sights from escaping? Before Noir's wings had covered them both up, the queen of the sluts had pounced on Eugene. To Sienna's dismay, Noir had pushed Eugene down and leaped on top of him. And who is Arya? Sienna scowled. Sienna's ears were sharp enough to be compared to Eugene's keen senses. She had clearly heard him say the name Arya. The moment that she heard that name, the queen of the sluts, Noir Giabella, had been greatly shaken by it. So much so that it had left Sienna wondering if Noir had truly just shown such passion and emotion or if it was just an act. And it wasn't just that. When Noir's wings had lifted, opening up the barrier, Eugene and Noir's lips had been stained with the same red color. A mix of blood and something glossy. Sienna barely managed to hold back her fist, which had felt like it was just about to unconsciously take a swing at Eugene. When she thought about it rationally, what if there had been an unsavory, scandalous and shameless kiss between Eugene and Noir? That definitely couldn't have been a willing act on Eugene's part. In fact, after her wings had been pulled back, the very first thing that Eugene had done was scrub at his lips until they were wiped raw. That was how Sienna could tell that the kiss must have definitely been forced onto him. That queen of the sluts, who didn't know the meaning of the word shame, must have acted just like her name would suggest and done something so thoughtless and dirty to Eugene. She had pounced on Eugene, who was unable to put up any resistance due to the backlash from ignition, straddled him and overpowered Eugene, who could only try to use his words to dissuade. Then, like a predator hunting down and devouring a weak herbivore, Noir must have slowly begun to satisfy her wildest desires. Gulp, Sienna swallowed a mouthful of saliva as such thoughts continued to run wild inside her head. She wasn't even hungry, so why was her mouth watering like this? Sienna was too afraid to actually look into the reason for her response. However, she could at least be certain of this much. Eugene was indeed a son of a bitch. Also, Sienna really couldn't hate that selfish and jerkish side of him. However, sometimes you still have to apply proper discipline, Sienna muttered in a low voice. Since he had done something naughty, she should firmly tell him no and give him the punishment he needed to improve. Therefore, Sienna didn't feel any regret or guilt for having smacked Eugene. There was no way for Eugene to know what kind of messy and complicated thoughts were going on in Sienna's head. Now that the pain that had felt like his arm was about to be torn off had subsided, Eugene asked her with a sour expression, "What are you talking about?" Sienna dismissed his question. "You don't need to know. If there's something you want to tell me, don't hide it, tell it to me straight," Eugene complained. "There is something I want to ask you right now, but I'll just talk to you later. Because it's probably not a question that should be asked at a place like this," Sienna explained as her eyes narrowed and she glared at Eugene. Sienna wasn't the only one directing that sort of look towards Eugene. Christina was descending from the sky while folding away each pair of wings in succession. She, as well as Anise, who was still inside her, were both sending Eugene the same sort of looks as Sienna. Anise clicked her tongue. She had a rough idea of what had happened. This was because she had already been told that Noir Giabella was the reincarnation of the saintess of the god of war back at Giabella Park. At that time, Eugene had also shown such extreme agitation as Noir had shown tonight. Although Eugene had put a nail in the issue, claiming that everything was fine and that nothing had changed, Anise wasn't stupid enough not to recognize his obvious bravado. However, even if all of his indifference were just a bluff, in the end, Eugene and Hamel would still try to kill Noir. Even though he might spend a long time hesitating and experience great anguish in the process, ultimately, Eugene still wouldn't stray from the choices that he had made. Truthfully, Anise hated that part of him. In her opinion, Hamel tended to choose the options that made things the hardest for himself. It was the same thing this time as well. It wasn't like Anise actually wanted for Noir to repent her sins and be forgiven. However, she was willing to compromise if that was what was needed. As long as they could guarantee firm control of Noir, Anise didn't believe it was truly a necessity to kill her. And if that was what Hamel secretly desired, then Anise would do her best to support his choice. though that was only if Hamel truly would suffer less by not killing Noir. However, there is no way Sir Eugene will change his mind, Christina muttered with a sigh. Anise had also come to the same conclusion, but she wasn't in the mood to smile at their shared exasperation at Eugene's stubbornness. Arya must be her actual name from their past lives, Anise worked out. Morgiabella must have truly awoken her past memories. I don't know what exactly those two might have been talking about. However, I can be sure of this much. Those two are still going to try and kill each other. Anise shared her opinion with Christina. It didn't matter to her what kind of emotions Noir might be feeling because of this. But if Hamel ended up feeling even greater pain because of this, it would break both Christina and Anise's hearts. It would have been better if Noir had never awakened her memories. Then Hamel wouldn't have had to see such a different side of her. Anise, there is only one solution to this problem, and I have no intention of trying to find a different solution either. So what if Noir is the reincarnation of the Twilight Witch? Whether or not Agaroth considered her to be someone special doesn't matter to me. That's even more reason why it shouldn't matter to you either. Because you aren't Agaroth. In other words, how I should think of Noir is an issue that can only be answered by myself. His words had been full of such bravado. I'm not going to come up with any other solutions apart from that one. It was just like Hamel and Eugene to say such a thing. His whole response to the issue matched perfectly with the image of him that Anise had built up inside her head. Thanks to that, she knew that Hamel would regret it if he had to kill Noir. Because the he that Anise knew was just that kind of man. Pushing her emotions to one side, Anise took a deep breath instead of sighing and said out loud, "For now we all need to get some rest." The war had ended with the victory of their allied forces. But before they could even celebrate their victory, far too many things had just happened. So Anise stepped forward to try to resolve the situation. Kaya! However, Anise was stopped from doing so because someone emitted a loud crow-like screech that interrupted her before she even finished speaking. The owner of that screeching voice was of course Malekith. Malekith had been sent sprawling along with the other wizards from the White Tower of Magic in the aftermath of Omega Force's destruction. As soon as her body had regained some strength, she immediately let out this piercing scream and was now rushing over towards Eugene. Eugene! Malekith cried out as she leaped across the sand and raced towards Eugene. But if Eugene were to be struck by Malekith's bodily assault in his current state, he might actually die from it. As Eugene let out a startled yelp, Ivatar quickly processed the situation and stepped forward with his hands raised to stop Malekith from colliding with Eugene. Then on top of that, Sienna used a spell to hold Malekith up in the air. Let go off me. Malekith shouted as she struggled to get free. I have something that I need to ask you. It's about what you said just now. Also, you said that if someone had something to say, they should just say it to you straight instead of hiding it, didn't you? At her shouts, a cold sweat broke out on Eugene's forehead. Are you really the reincarnation of the stupid Hamel? Malekith demanded. Although he had expected to be asked this question, Eugene still squeezed his eyes shut in pained frustration. Chapter 498, Delusion 6. Just how many more times today would he be forced to make this declaration? Eugene had made the first declaration back during his battle against the Spectre. His words had been meant for Gavid, who was looking down on their battle from his position high in the sky. While swinging his sword, Eugene had suddenly declared, I am Hamel. That was how he had phrased it. Then again just a few minutes earlier, in order to prove it to Gavid, and so that everyone present could hear him, he had loudly declared once more, I am Hamel's reincarnation. This chapter is up.d by freewebnovel.com. This meant that he had already made the same declaration twice today. But looking at the current atmosphere, it seemed like he might have to do it one more time. Eugene furrowed his brow and glared at Malekith, who was suspended in the air. She was still struggling to try to get free from the binding of Sienna's spell. Eugene furrowed his brow and glared at Malekith, who was suspended in the air. She was still struggling to try to get free from the binding of Sienna's spell. Eugene silently considered the spirit summoner. In many ways he did have a good opinion of Malekith. If Eugene had to be honest, their track record together had been so good that he couldn't find any real reason to dislike her. That was just how much of a help Malekith had been for Eugene up until now, especially after considering the newfound strength that Malekith had managed to reach. She would continue to be of great help to Eugene in the future as well. That was why he didn't want to sour their relationship. So Eugene was willing to go along with whatever Malkuth wanted and listen to her requests, at least up to a certain line, so long as there was a clear exchange of interests involved. However now, Eugene felt like he might be developing a bit of a grudge towards Malkuth. His desire to keep up a good relationship with her was steadily growing thinner. Eugene, why aren't you saying anything? I'm asking you, are you really the reincarnation of the stupid Hamel? Malkuth yelled down at him. After listening to her shout like this, Eugene realized on second thought that Gavid had actually been quite the gentleman. Even though they were enemies, at least that bastard had spoken to Eugene in a tone full of respect. Gavid had called Eugene Hamel of extermination. That was the epithet that had been given to Hamel by the demon folk. However, Eugene was actually very satisfied with that name. After all, it at least sounded much more impressive than a shitty title like the stupid Hamel. In that sense, Eugene couldn't help but think that Malkuth was quite impressive. To think that she would shout out such a nickname directly in front of the person, especially one that had no redeeming qualities to it. You really are the reincarnation of the stupid Hamel. Malkuth loudly squealed. She raised her arms above her head and began clapping her hands together, like a cheerleader trying to work up a crowd, and began to chant, the PID. Malkuth was enthusiastically clapping in time with her chants. She glared at her fellow wizards who were still sprawled on the ground next to her. The wizards from the White Tower of Magic, who had been the ones closest to her, didn't even have the right to refuse. So the wizards forced their tired and aching bodies to stand, and then they started clapping along with Malkuth as they repeated her chants. Ha. Mel. The. Zu. PID. Ha. Mel. Just what on earth was she trying to do? What was the meaning behind her chanting? Why did she then have to go and pull others into the chanting instead of just making a fuss all on her own? And why wasn't she satisfied already with just the wizards from the White Tower of Magic? Why was she trying to attract even more people to join in? The. He. Ro. Eu. Jing. Li. On. Heart. Why had she changed the chanting from the stupid Hamel to Eugene Lionheart? What on earth was the meaning behind such a change in designation? Some of the people who hadn't dared to move their lips out of tactfulness when she was shouting the stupid Hamel were subtly beginning to respond more and more after the chanting had turned into the hero Eugene Lionheart. Was that why she had changed it? Just what on earth was Malkuth El-Haya's goal in trying to make everyone here cheer for Eugene? Inside Eugene's cloak, WYD began to hum. Tempest had been forced into an irrevocable and irresistible contract with Malkuth. Now his voice was heard inside Eugene's head. Hamel, that thing isn't human. It's just something wearing the face of a human. It might look like a human, but it doesn't think like one. Whoever created that thing may have bestowed it with great talent, but in return, its creator left a huge hole where its fundamental nature as a human being should be. During the implementation of Omega Force, when I was forced to become one with Malkuth El-Haya, it felt like I was drifting through an abyss. It was like peering into a deep ocean that didn't have an end in sight. I don't know how to put into words the terror of the unknown that sight struck into me. When I and the other spirit kings fused with the great chaos that swirls within Malkuth El-Haya. My honor was, Tempest's voice trailed off in a trembling murmur. The R.A.D. Ant. The number of people shouting had increased. The new voice belonged to Carmen. She had also been caught up in Gavid's sword wind, so her face was covered in blood, but surprisingly enough she didn't seem to have any other injuries. This had to be because of the outstanding performance of her Exid, the demon dragon armor, which had been specially modified for her use. So when Carmen, who was in a much healthier state than any of the others present, shouted, her voice rang out much louder than anyone else's. The R.A.D. Ant. Carmen was very attached to the title she had come up with for Eugene all by herself. While she also liked some of his other titles such as the Dragon Slayer and the Blood Lion, she was especially enamored with the radiant Eugene Lionheart, so much so that she had unconsciously let out a shiver the moment she said those words. As such, she wanted to make sure that everyone would start calling Eugene with that epithet. The Great Vermouth, the Brave Molin, the Faithful Anise, the Wise Sienna, the Stupid Hamel, and also the Radiant Eugene Lionheart. The R.A.D. Ant. A vein was throbbing on Carmen's neck. Her voice, which was so loud that it could even be compared to a lion's roar, rang throughout the night sky and shook the desert below. Once Carmen started shouting like this, the black lions who were following her were left with no choice but to start shouting along with Carmen. Boom boom boom. Their feet all stomped together in a disciplined beat. However, no dusty clouds of sand were raised by their stomping. This was because Carmen and her black lion's cries were so loud that they scattered any clouds of sand before they could form. Jean. Lee. On. Heart. Just, how on earth was he meant to react to this? Eugene's shoulders suddenly began to shake. Startled by this sudden development, Eugene glanced to the side at the cause of this vibration. Ivatar still had a serious expression on his face, but Eugene could tell that the man's cheeks were twitching slightly. It seemed that Ivatar had some concerns about whether or not it was appropriate to laugh in the current situation, so he was forcefully holding back his laughter, causing the shaking that Eugene had felt through his shoulders. Eugene hesitated. If things continued like this, the thousands of people gathered here would end up chanting the name of Eugene Lionheart. In fact, this wasn't a bad thing for Eugene. Instead, it was actually something that Eugene should be hoping for. After all, that was how a cult usually formed. However, now wasn't the time for that. Eugene wasn't in a state to handle all this. In fact, if his body had been in healthy condition, he would have slapped the cheeks of everyone who had started shouting his name. Naturally, Melkith in particular was deserving of a beating. Carmen had also left him with no other choice. Eugene would have to find the time to teach her a lesson she wouldn't forget. Eugene suddenly heard a deep voice amidst all of these loud shouts. It wasn't a part of the chanting, instead the voice quietly muttered, "The radiant Eugene Lionheart." This voice came from Gilead. He was standing, supported from the side by Cyan, and softly muttering the name to himself as if to try and memorize it. Appearing to be extremely moved by something, Gilead's eyes had even started to well up with tears. At his side, Cyan was already shedding thick streams of tears, and Seal had also started sniffling. After silently gazing at his family, Eugene couldn't help but cancel his plan to slap every single person currently shouting his name. Eugene let out a deep sigh as he turned to look at the saints and Sienna. He couldn't tell which of the saints was currently in charge of their body, but judging by their expression, whoever it was seemed very satisfied by the current situation. As for Sienna, she was smiling right at him, openly finding amusement in Eugene's situation. Eugene tried to find his words. The stupid Hamel. The hero Eugene Lionheart. The radiant Eugene Lionheart. The voices shouting these three separate names sounded like they were gradually coming to an agreement and settling down on shouting the radiant Eugene Lionheart all together. Struggling to speak, Eugene finally squeezed out, That's enough. He was speaking in a low voice, but every single person who was passionately chanting his name still managed to hear what Eugene had said. Their chanting, which had seemed like it would last for several days, suddenly came to a stop. Thousands of eyes all turned towards Eugene. "I've got it already, so let's just stop here," Eugene said with a sigh. Just what had he gotten from their shouting? Even Eugene, the one who had personally said these words, didn't know what he meant by them. However, Eugene sincerely meant every single word that he said. He desperately hoped that they would just stop embarrassing him by chanting his name like that. "Give us a speech," Melkith shouted. With her eyes sparkling brightly, she appealed to Eugene. "Eugene, are you really the reincarnation of the stupid Hamel?" "That's right," Eugene confirmed curtly. Oh my god. Oh my god. Oh my god. So that means reincarnation truly is possible. Moreover, yours wasn't just any ordinary reincarnation, was it? Melkith screamed shrilly. "The ancestor of your family, whom everyone always brings up whenever there is an opening. The great Vermouth. You were actually comrades with him. And the hero that you've always said you respect more than Vermouth. The stupid Hamel. You were actually talking about yourself. To become a wizard, one needed to have a sharp mind. This was because if one wanted to become a wizard, one needed to be able to memorize more than just one or two formulas. As for the archwizards, who were the exceptions even among the other wizards, it would be no exaggeration to say that they possessed the keenest minds in the whole collection of wizards. Of course, there were many different ways in which such a sharp mind could express itself, but at the very least all archwizards had to possess excellent memories. In other words, Melkith also possessed an exceptional memory. She could remember each of the compliments aimed at Hamel that Eugene had said in passing without even giving it much thought. No way, no freaking way. How could this be? I always thought that reincarnation itself is absurd and unbelievable, but isn't it even more absurd and unbelievable to actually use your reincarnation to pretend to be someone else, act all innocent and then sing praises for yourself, too? How could you even do something like that? Malkuth shouted as she placed her hands on her head in a look of utter shock. Surprisingly enough, Malkuth wasn't even showing a single trace of malice as she said all this. She truly had simply said these things because she didn't understand how Eugene could have had the guts to do such a thing in the past. However, it didn't feel that way to Eugene. He couldn't understand what kind of malicious grudge Malkuth must have been harboring to harass him like this in such a public location. That is, Eugene stammered, unable to think of what to say in response. To think that he would actually be cross-examined like this so publicly. At that moment, Sienna stepped forward to speak for Eugene. It's understandable. Huh? Malkuth said in confusion. It's understandable. Sienna just repeated herself. What did she mean by that? Even Eugene turned to look at Sienna in confusion. Eugene wasn't the only one with such perplexed emotion in their eyes. Everyone was looking at Sienna with bewildered expressions. Malkuth frowned. Big sis, what are you saying all of a sudden? Sienna's hair slowly began to stand on end. Her eyes glowed with an inner light. A galaxy opened up behind Sienna. Understandable. That was enough. None of the thousands of people present were willing to question Sienna any further. They just calmly nodded in acceptance. Even Malkuth didn't dare to demand a further explanation from Sienna. This was because Malkuth personally knew all too well just how forceful and scary Sienna could be when she got like this. That's right, big sis, of course it's understandable, Malkuth agreed with a nod, having quickly adapted her attitude. No matter how much she thought about it, Malkuth still couldn't understand how shameless someone would have to be to do such a thing. But it was clear that if she continued to pursue this topic any further, she would just end up being scolded by Sienna. No, perhaps it wouldn't just end on the level of a scolding. She might even end up getting killed. That was just how intense the murderous intent dwelling within Sienna's eyes was. There's no way that Malkuth could have known this, but Sienna also had a desperate and unavoidable reason to step forward at this moment. If Eugene were forced to give an explanation for his actions, there was a very good chance that he would express how upset he was about the nickname given to him in the fairy tale. In that case, what if he publicly revealed who the author of the fairy tale was? And after all, Eugene did have good reason to feel personally attacked due to the ruined reputation of his past life. Then what was so wrong about using a different identity to sing his own praises? Sienna sincerely believed that such actions were understandable. Ahem, Anise awkwardly cleared her throat. Anise was also in agreement with Sienna. After all, it was all because of the two of them, the wise Sienna and the faithful Anise, that Hamel had ended up with such an insulting title. How wonderful, Lovelian said haltingly as he started sniffling in a corner all by himself. The secret he believed was known only to him had finally been revealed. A relationship that transcended a whole 300 years had finally been resurrected, and a new chapter was being written for the fairy tale that had once ended in a tragedy. Lovelian started clapping as he pictured the course of their romance inside his head. He felt the urge to play the violin like he had in Shimuan, but the entrance to his pantheon had been destroyed, so it was difficult for him to use any summoning magic right now. So instead, Lovelian just continued clapping with all his heart and soul. When the usually serious Red Tower Master started such a round of applause, it created a far different response than when Malkuth had tried it. Almost all of the wizards present started clapping with him. All of this is the light's will, Raphael declared as he also started applauding with a sense of wonder. All of the paladins and priests were already clapping for Eugene. The radiant Eugene Lionheart. Carmen also shouted once more. Eugene's only thought at this moment was that he just wanted to go home already. Reincarnation, Balzac muttered to himself in awe, standing behind the rest of the crowd. He wrapped his other hand around his trembling arm and squeezed down tightly. Earlier, Balzac had faced off against some monsters of mysterious origin. Although they weren't demonic beasts, they seemed more demonic than any of the other demonic beasts, and each of the monsters seemed to possess a closer connection to the power of destruction than destruction's own vassals. Balzac had used his new signature, gluttony, to devour all of the corpses of those monsters. Not only that, but he also swept up all the corpses of any deceased demon folk that he managed to lay his eyes on. This overindulgence that had pushed his body far beyond its limits had left his arm unable to feel any sensation other than pain, and the process of fusing these newly acquired resources into himself was so excruciating that it made him want to vomit them out right away. However, at this moment, Balzac couldn't feel any of his previous pain. His head, which had been clouded and throbbing in agony, instead seemed to have cleared up instantly. Like everyone else here, he felt awed and mystified by the sudden news of Hamel's reincarnation. Balzac could never have imagined that reincarnation was actually possible. Not only that, this wasn't just any ordinary reincarnation either. Thanks to this reincarnation, the title of the hero had actually been inherited many generations later by another member of the Lionheart family. Nobody could believe that this was just a coincidence. It was definitely not a coincidence that a new hero had been born after 300 years. It was fate that ensured Hamel Dynas would be reincarnated as Eugene Lionheart. It was also fate that led the Demon King of Incarceration, who had upheld the peace for such a long period of time, to announce that the end of the oath was approaching. In that case, Balzac shivered in excitement. Soon the final act of this era would be upon them. He didn't know if everything would just end there or if they would be able to survive and move on to the next chapter, but even so, Balzac at least felt grateful to be alive in this present era. Chapter 499. Delusion 7. Huh, she's still not dead yet? Eugene suddenly muttered with a disdainful snort. He had clashed with the specter in the sky while thousands of Nur and the allied forces had crashed into each other on the ground. As a result, Horia had been completely devastated. It was no exaggeration to say that there weren't any buildings left standing in good condition. Despite this, Amelia, who they had left on the roof of a building, was still alive and well. No, she couldn't really be called well. Although there weren't any physical injuries on her, Amelia's mind was still trapped in the nightmares that Sienna had shown her. The fact that Amelia had survived while all the buildings around her had collapsed wasn't because she had been particularly lucky. Sienna had simply left behind a barrier to protect Amelia. I really wanted to just get rid of her, Sienna confessed, pouting her lips in displeasure. Aiming a kick at Amelia, who was currently sprawled on the ground, she continued speaking, but I thought that I should get your opinion first. Well, you didn't really need to be so considerate, Eugene said as he approached Amelia. In fact, by this point, Eugene didn't care at all about Amelia's life or death. This was because Eugene had already become far stronger to pay any attention to something as weak as Amelia. On top of that, he had already seen her do such a shameful act as getting down on her knees and begging him for her life that he could honestly say that he didn't care anymore whether or not Amelia lived or died. Bloody Mary, 1. Eugene muttered as the staff caught his eye. There was no need to take a second look at Amelia herself, but this staff was a different story. Eugene grinned as he looked down at Blood Mary, which Amelia was still holding in her hand. This was the magic staff that had been passed down through the hands of all the previous staffs of incarceration. It was on par with Akasha because of how it had been created with the full and luxurious use of an entire dragon heart. And just like how Akasha had been imbued with the ability to comprehend all other magic formulas, Blood Mary was also imbued with its own special ability. With this staff, you can inherit the magic used by its previous holders. Sienna spoke up in explanation as she stood next to Eugene. Eugene hummed thoughtfully, but that's not an ability you'd be all that interested in, isn't that right? Maybe if I was a black wizard, Sienna said with a grin. Eugene also grinned back as he nodded. All of Blood Mary's previous holders had served the Demon King as the staff of incarceration. For a black wizard, it would be a very enticing prospect to be able to inherit the magic of these predecessors without any effort. But neither Eugene nor Sienna had any interest in black magic. That said, it would also be ridiculous to give something like this to Balzac, Eugene thought as his mind turned to Balzac, who wasn't currently accompanying them. Even if Balzac wouldn't immediately turn on them after receiving the staff, it was an indisputable fact that they would end up fighting him at some point. Balzac had managed to gain a great deal through the course of this war. Gluttony, his newly created signature spell, allowed him to absorb the strength and memories of those that he devoured with his hand. On the battlefield, Balzac had devoured large amounts of demon folk, demonic beasts, and on top of that, the Nur as well. Eugene had deliberately overlooked Balzac's rapid growth. Even if Balzac had increased his strength through such predation, he would never be able to surpass Sienna in terms of magic. This was something that would still apply even if he continued to mindlessly build up his reserves of dark power. To be honest, Eugene didn't really think of Balzac as an enemy. Not only did Balzac himself seem to lack any sense of hostility towards them, but it was also because his secret wish to become a legendary wizard felt both pure and sincere to Eugene. However, they would still end up fighting someday. Even if Balzac himself didn't wish to do so, as long as Eugene had his sights set on the Demon King of Incarceration, he would inevitably have to fight Balzac at some point. If they did end up fighting, then Eugene hoped that Balzac would at least be able to put up a satisfying fight. Balzac still might not be able to qualify as Eugene's enemy even with all the strength that he had gained through his predations, but even so, giving him Blood Mary would be crossing the line, Eugene sighed regretfully. His desire for a good fight wasn't strong enough that he would go so far as to give such a dangerous gift as Blood Mary to Balzac. So what should we do with it? Eugene turned to the side and asked. For now I'll keep it, Sienna replied. Eugene's eyes widened in surprise at her answer. You're not really going to try and learn from its black magic, are you? I don't have any intention of learning it, but I do have some desire to study the knowledge it contains, Sienna answered him with a smile. After all, black magic is still ultimately another type of magic. On top of that, if you really think about it, all of the past staffs of incarceration must have been some of the most exceptional black wizards of their era. Although they still wouldn't be as great as this wise lady Sienna. But why do you need to keep it on you? Eugene pressed out of concern. Sienna replied, if I want to become the goddess of magic, doesn't that mean I have to be fluent in all things that can be called magic? Although she had a smile on her face and her voice seemed light-hearted, the look in Sienna's eyes was extremely serious. Eugene could also sense that those words definitely weren't meant as a joke. You're getting closer, Eugene abruptly commented. She was getting closer? Sienna, who had just picked up Blood Mary, blinked in surprise at these words that had seemingly come out of nowhere. What are you talking about all of a sudden? Sienna demanded. Eugene shrugged. It's hard to explain exactly, but that's just the feeling I'm getting. Sienna frowned. Really? If that's what you want to say, then it really must be the case. Sienna recalled what Eugene had looked like when he was engulfed in light. No, at that moment Eugene hadn't just seemed to be surrounded by the light. He looked as if he had become one with the light. At that moment Sienna had also gotten a similar kind of feeling from him. It really felt like the both of us weren't exactly humans, Sienna recalled. She had definitely sensed that she had somehow managed to surpass her previous level of existence. Sienna pursed her lips as she looked down at Blood Mary. Her new spell, Absolute Decree, was definitely something that went beyond the level of mere magic, but there were many areas in which it was still lacking. In order to reach her goal of becoming the goddess of magic, it seemed that Sienna wouldn't just have to surpass her previous level, but she would have to reach a whole new level. Are you going to extract the dragon heart from it? Eugene asked. Sienna shook her head. No, what I'm using is already extravagant enough. I don't really need another dragon heart. If she hadn't created her Absolute Decree, she might have held some desire to use the dragon heart to compensate for the damage to her eternal whole, but the current Sienna had no need for another dragon heart. After I finished using it for my own purposes and cleaning up all of the dark power accumulated in it, I wonder if I'll still be able to find some use for it. Well, I can always give as a gift to another wizard, or perhaps I'll hand it over to the Lion Hearts. Sienna considered thoughtfully. I feel like it could be used to enhance the Patriarch or Lady Carmen's exit, or perhaps you could give it Genos. I feel like it might also be a good idea to give it to Sir Lovelian, Eugene said without giving it much thought, but the moment she heard these words, Sienna's eyes immediately narrowed. Why are you still calling Lovelian Sir when you've already revealed to everyone that you're Hamel's reincarnation? Sienna questioned Eugene. At this point, wouldn't it be weird for me just to start casually addressing him as Lovelian? Eugene defended awkwardly. What's so weird about that? Sienna argued back. I just think that it would be weird. I'll take some time to think it over by myself, so there's no need to make a fuss about it, Eugene muttered as he avoided meeting her gaze for no apparent reason. Eugene had his own standards when it came to how politely he treated certain people. For those with an impressive character and who had always done well by him, Eugene saw Lovelian and Gilead, who both qualified in those respects, as people worthy of being addressed by him as Sir. But in that case, what about Lady Melkith? Eugene asked himself. Until now, Eugene had always addressed Melkith as Lady Melkith whenever he spoke to her. However, how was he supposed to address her from now on? That Melkith el-Haya, was she someone whom he needed to treat with such respect? Eugene had to acknowledge that Melkith was one of the most powerful wizards of this current era. So, there was no way Melkith could be excluded when the time came for an all-out war against Helmuth. However, apart from her incredible power, what was the rest of Melkith el-Haya's character like? The hero that you've always said you respect more than Vermouth. The stupid Hamel. You were actually talking about yourself. The more he thought about it, the more his hackles rose, too. Jurk. As Eugene started grinding his teeth in anger, Anise, who was supporting him from the side, suddenly spanked Eugene on the butt. Bam. Arg. Eugene screamed in pain. In contrast to the crisp sound of the slap, the agony of the blow seemed to echo deep into his bones. Eugene's body involuntarily staggered forward due to this unexpected and unguarded blow. Of course, Anise wouldn't just let Eugene fall like this. Her arm coiled around Eugene's chest like a snake as she held him up. Eugene struggled to hold in a groan. She was holding him far too close. Eugene gritted his teeth as he tried to ignore the soft touch that was pressing against the side of his arm. If you get angry, it will just delay your recovery, Anise whispered into her ear. Eugene felt extremely aggrieved by these words. Was she really trying to warn him that if he got angry, his recovery would be delayed? While it was questionable whether such a thing could even be scientifically verified until now, the number of times that he had gotten angry while suffering from the backlash of using ignition had to already be in the dozens at the very least. It was obviously just an excuse for her to spank him. Eugene didn't bother to ask for her reason for doing this and just quietly kept his mouth shut. In fact, Eugene knew that such a weak excuse couldn't have been the only reason Anise had done such a thing. Shooting Eugene another glance, Anise whispered into his ear, "What did you talk about with that slut?" Eugene stubbornly stayed silent. "Hamel, if you really don't want to talk about it, then I won't pry into it too deeply. Because I can respect your freedom of choice. Even though the smell of that whore is still lingering strongly on your lips. Even if it's not just your lips and her body odor seems to be covering every inch of your body, I still won't ask the reason for that," Anise said with a cold smile. Squeeze. The sensation of the soft pressure pushing against his arm grew even stronger. And with each whisper from Anise, Sienna's eyes seemed to be growing increasingly sharper. "However," Anise whispered, "even though I do respect your choices, I can't help but feel disappointed. That's right, I'm sure that these feelings of disappointment towards you will linger for quite some time." I wasn't thinking of keeping it a secret," Eugene hurriedly clarified. "I just thought that right now wasn't the best time for us to talk about it." Anise pressed him. "And just what kind of time were you waiting for exactly? Were you planning on finding us a quiet room somewhere, sitting all of us down over drinks of alcohol or tea before you finally said something?" How had she known what he was thinking? Eugene swallowed back a gulp as he tried to examine both Anise and Sienna's expressions. Eugene hesitated. "It's just that right now is a bit too." The three of them were standing in the ruins of what had once been Horia. Although there wasn't anyone nearby, the Liberation Army was currently in the middle of searching every corner of the city. The stated purpose for doing so was to find any survivors left in the city or any remnants of the enemy, though nobody really believed that either possibility held any likelihood. This search was really an opportunity for the soldiers to claim any loot that might have been buried in the wreckage. "And then there's still her as well," Eugene tried to argue as his eyes lowered to look down on Amelia. Amelia, who was sprawled out on the ground like a puppet with all her strings cut, occasionally twitched and moved her lips, but she never actually said anything. Anise snorted. "So what? She's in such a state that it can't even really be called living. Should we just end her?" Eugene asked for the saint's opinion. Anise shook her head. "No way, Hamel, I can't allow that. If she dies, wouldn't that mean she'll be free from all this pain?" Eugene frowned. "Won't she end up going to hell anyway? Living like this will surely be even more agonizing than dying and going to hell, so we shouldn't kill her. In fact, we should ensure that she stays alive for a very long time from now on," Anise stubbornly insisted. This was because, just like Eugene, Anise had also happened to hold a strong grudge against Amelia. Although she had missed the opportunity to inflict her own brand of punishment on the necromancer, she didn't want Amelia, who had dared to desecrate Hamel's body, To have the easy option of a quick death. All right, Eugene finally gave in, finding nothing else that he could use to distract them. With a deep sigh, Eugene organized his thoughts. First of all, he needed to explain that Noir was the reincarnation of the Twilight Witch. The Saints were already aware of this fact, but Sienna didn't know about his shared past with Noir. Though I didn't want to inform her about it like this, Eugene thought regretfully. Due to the backlash from Ignition, he was currently in a state where it was impossible for him to keep standing without any support. While enduring the thought that he must currently be making for quite a pathetic sight, Eugene began to speak. He talked about how Noir Giabella was the reincarnation of the Twilight Witch and how Noir had managed to recall her past life today. Noir's emotions had subsequently gone out of control. Unable to hold it in, she had pounced on him, and then they had continued to have a conversation in the darkness of her enclosed wings. They had confirmed each other's identities, feelings, and desires. That was all that had happened. From the beginning of Eugene's story until the very end, Sienna never once interrupted him. Her expression was so calm that even Eugene found it surprising. Instead, it was Anise who had to suppress an emotional outburst by biting down on her lips several times during Eugene's explanation. "You," Sienna slowly said, ending the short-lived silence. Her deep green eyes stared into Eugene's as she asked him, "Are you really okay with that?" Earlier, when he had imagined her reaction, Eugene had pictured Sienna asking him, "Why didn't you tell me anything earlier?" However, Sienna didn't ask such a question. So why didn't she ask Eugene that? It was because Sienna herself had already come to accept that Eugene was just that type of person. This son of a bitch had always been like this. He always tried to keep all of the painful things to himself. This habit of his hadn't seemed to have changed even after he had died. Sienna addressed him seriously, "Eugene, if you're really okay with that, then I am also okay with it. Because I also want to kill that queen of sluts, Noir Giabella." Whatever worries Eugene might be having, whatever emotions he might be feeling, Sienna didn't have the confidence that she would be able to sympathize with any of them. Whatever emotions Eugene and Noir might have for each other was a matter for those two alone, and Sienna definitely couldn't and wouldn't interfere with that. However, if you're not all right with that, then I'm not okay with that as well. If you don't want to kill her, if you're suffering because of that, Sienna's words slowly trailed off. Staying quiet, Sienna just stared directly into Eugene's eyes. This was Eugene, who was currently being supported by Anise because he definitely wouldn't be able to stay standing on his own. The same Eugene who just a few moments ago had shown his ugly side by making up all sorts of excuses for not wanting to talk about it. Right now. No, Sienna shook her head. He seemed to be mired down by something. To Sienna's senses, Eugene's emotions felt complex and murky. His lingering attachment, regrets, and other such feelings. In the end, it was only natural that Eugene would feel such emotions. No matter what choice he might end up making, he would still ultimately experience some regret for not choosing the other option. However, it was from amidst such emotions that his firm will shone through. Eugene might be stupid and crude, but in the end, this man in front of her would still choose to do what he thought was the right thing. And even though he might end up with some regrets and feel dissatisfied with his choice, he would still ultimately be able to overcome such feelings. But maybe, just maybe, if he found it difficult to stand up on his own, then just like now, Sienna firmly told herself, all Sienna could do was continue to support him by his side. Until he was able to stand up and walk forward on his own. That was why Sienna had trailed off and shaken her head. She didn't ask him any more questions. She didn't want to shake Eugene's resolve in the choice that he had made. "But you still deserve to be hit at least once," Sienna said as she began rolling up her sleeves. Eugene's expression twisted at these words. He swallowed back a gulp as his shoulders trembled. "But I feel like that wasn't the kind of mood we had going on, was it?" Eugene feebly tried to protest. "Allow me to make the decision on that," Sienna firmly insisted. "At least tell me why you're hitting me all of a sudden," Eugene weakly complained. "You admitted that you were keeping secrets from me, didn't you?" Sienna pointed out. Eugene's eyes wavered. You should be thankful that I'm letting you off with just one hit," Sienna told him as she walked over to Eugene, loosening up her right arm by swinging it in circles. Eugene instinctively tried to run away, but with Anise's arm coiled around him like a snake, it was impossible for him to escape. Instead, Anise even spun around with Eugene, adjusting the angle so that it would be easier for Sienna to strike him. Eugene tried to count his blessings. At the very least, I'm lucky that there's no one around to see. Crack. Eugene's thoughts were suddenly cut off by the sharp pain searing through his butt. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The door made of chains closed behind him as Gavid stepped through. He was back in Pandemonium on the 90th floor of the Demon King's castle, Babel. This was the same office that Gavid had used for the past hundreds of years. Gavid stood in the center of his office, lost in his own thoughts. Reincarnation. Gavid rolled the word around in his head. There was no way that the Demon King of Incarceration couldn't know about this fact. From the moment the Demon King met Eugene Lionheart in person, no, even before that. I don't understand, Gavid frowned in thought. Ever since he began serving the Demon King of Incarceration, he had never once doubted his Demon King's will. If the Demon King ever did anything that was difficult to understand, then Gavid wouldn't even bother to try and understand it. He didn't forcefully try to comprehend just what might even be going through the Demon King of Incarceration's heart. For him, as the blade of incarceration, the will of the Demon King had always been something absolute and something that should never be questioned. However, now Gavid could no longer do that. While slowly calming his agitated breaths, Gavid lowered one hand to his waist. His hand came to rest on his demon sword, Glory. Gavid unfastened the demon sword from his waist and hung it on the wall. Then he stood in front of a mirror and checked the state of his current attire. Gavid brushed some disheveled hair back into place. Then he took a few more deep breaths. Will this really be the first time? Gavid muttered to himself with a wry smile as he turned around. In all these past hundreds of years, Gavid had never once headed up into the Demon King's private quarters of his own volition. Gavid had only ever waited in his office for the Demon King to descend when ready. However, now he wasn't going to just continue waiting. Gavid was going to push open the doors to the royal palace to finally get an answer to all of his questions.